Okay, it's time for This Day in History,
This day in history.
a topic near and dear to my heart. On this day in history, in 1961, the United States cut off diplomatic relations with Cuba. I know, it was terrible. Luckily, the president stockpiled all of his Cuban cigars before that happened. Now, after 2 years of deteriorating relations, we closed our embassy in Havana. I love Cuba. I traveled there for a weekend in June with our senior producer, Jonathan Hay, and Daily Wire God King, Jeremy Boring. They have very delicious stogies there, beautiful peaches, truly wonderful people. But the United States has bungled our relations with that island ever since Fidel Castro seized power in 1959. And this has a lot to do with what we're talking about today. Those errors almost plunged the world into global nuclear conflict during the Cuban Missile Crisis. These decisions say a lot about confrontation and appeasement. Bill Buckley, William F. Buckley Jr., when he started the National Review, founded the modern conservative movement, he refused to support Dwight Eisenhower because he considered him too soft on communism. Cuba is the prime example of that. In early 1960, Castro signed a trade treaty with the Soviet Union. In response, the U.S. began funding and training a group of Cuban expats to overthrow the dictator. All well and good to get a commie out of there. Trouble is, that campaign was tempered, it was moderate, it was bit by bit. So Castro began stealing even more private property. To this day, Cuba is essentially a mafia nation. It's a mafia-run nation with the Castros at the helm of it all. So in response then to that, the Castros stealing private property, including countless American interests, the U.S. began to implement certain cutbacks in trade with Cuba. Too little, too late. 2 months later, just a few months into his presidency, John F. Kennedy sent the Cuban exile force into Cuba during the Bay of Pigs debacle. It was a major failure. It was a major setback for the Kennedy administration. Just 1 year later, the United States entered into a 13-day standoff during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest the 50-year Cold War ever came to direct nuclear conflict. Two big nuclear buttons, both of which worked on two separate desks. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev had met Kennedy 4 months earlier, and his impression was that Kennedy was weak. Again, the perception of weakness, the perception that these people had, that this superpower had lost its resolve. He installed missiles just 90 miles off American shores, with Fidel Castro chomping at the bit to launch them. How many times had the U.S. weakly challenged Castro, tried to assassinate him, tried to invade? In fact, many historians credit Castro's hot-headedness with helping to convince Khrushchev to back off. Now, as a result of this bungled foreign policy, the United States was forced to remove our missiles from Turkey, though fortunately nuclear war was averted. What should we learn from all of these episodes, past and present? Peace can only be maintained with the credible threat of force. As Ronald Reagan put it, peace through strength. Teddy Roosevelt said to speak softly and carry a big stick. But sometimes you can't speak softly. Sometimes you have to speak bigly, especially on Twitter. And in those cases, everybody needs to know that we have a big button on our desks, and it works.